Then they give lots of individuals to get access to use their upstairs to store the files.
Good morning. Good morning. Sorry for the delayed start. People are still coming, but thank you very much for coming this morning. It's a bit cold today, so if you're staying for the party, we are sitting inside. So welcome to this public meeting of the United Nations Association Harpenden. My name is Suhail Shahryar. I'm the chair of the UNA Harpenden. We're privileged to have as our guest speaker, Peter Segal. He'll be talking about boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. The talk will last about 30, 40 minutes?
No, it won't last 40 minutes.
So 30 minutes.
Yeah, I'll try and stretch it.
30 minutes. And will be followed by Q&A for another 30 minutes. We also have a Gaggle mail group. So if you want to continue the discussion afterwards by email, there's a restricted group of people who join email can discuss the topic afterwards by email when you're at home, but you don't have to join. After the garden party, those who have registered, they are welcome to our annual garden party. It's probably not going to be in the garden. Thank you for contributing a savory and or a sweet dish and paying the admission price of £5. If there's a fire or an emergency, please vacate the building through the door you came through, the front door. Now, a brief mention about who and what United Nations Harpenden is. We are a civil society group that has existed in Harpenden since 1922. I might add, before I was born. It was initially a branch of the League of Nations. In 1947, this became a local group of the United Nations Association UK. As well as Harpenden, we cover St. Albans and Welwyn Garden City. I mean, they used to have their own local groups, and they've closed and absorbed into our group. Our mailing list has about 300 subscribers. We campaign on issues relevant to the UN and the work carried out by its various organs, such as UNHCR, UNICEF, WHO, etc. We focus on issues such as ending conflicts and wars, improving human rights, sustainable development, climate change, and even reforming the UN itself, which it badly needs, I believe. Our group is associated with UNA UK, which is a national body and a charity. Based in Whitehall, London, they lobby our MPs and peers on issues related to the UN. Each year, we join our sister groups to draft resolutions on global issues and submit them to the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office to influence government policy. As a group, we hold regular public meetings, usually in Salvation Army Hall next to Waitrose. We have talks from guest speakers from universities, NGOs, and UN agencies. Admission to our talks are free. There's no membership fee. To attend, you can register online. However, we appreciate any money you may give or have given to cover our expenses. Our next public talk will be on Saturday, 6th of July at the Salvation Army. This talk is entitled The Decline of the Unipolar World, to be given by Professor Glenn Deason of the University of Southeastern Norway. The speaker actually will be speaking remotely from Norway while we are seated in the hall. It'll be a hybrid meeting for people who want to attend from home. If you've missed any of our previous talks, you can catch up via our recordings posted on our website. This meeting is also being recorded for people who haven't been able to attend. We have a monthly newsletter with UN and other news. It's called Aperta. Subscription is via email. We hold discussion group meetings, an annual garden party, Christmas quiz evening, and we are planning to hold a regular coffee morning at a local pub. We have a small committee of elected members wearing badges like this. Please feel free to come to us if you want to join the committee. We need people. Now to our guest speaker. Brought up in a Reformed Jewish family, Peter Segal went to a kibbutz in Israel in his gap year. This experience led to him becoming a campaigner for justice for Palestinians. In the subsequent 40 years, he has been involved in the formation of Twinning with the West Bank Village, the foundation of St. Albans Friends of Palestine, and has supported Palestinian farmers during the olive harvest, which are regularly attacked by settlers. So without further ado, Peter Segal.
Thank you very much. Right. So just wrote them down. Right, I'm going to start with, yes, I know the cough is irritating. My wife Angela has reminded me for the last 4 weeks how irritating it is. I'm really sorry, but it's not infectious. That's the good news. And I will try and keep it to the minimum. So thank you very much for the invite. I will refer to BDS because if I say boycott, divestment and sanctions every time, the meeting will be much longer than 40 minutes. So if we can just stick with BDS, I didn't design that. This is the official BDS. It's the official BDS logo. Right, I'll go with that one. Right.
It's not happening. Okay, here. Press here.
There.
Yeah.
Right. I think this is a remarkably good quote, but I did think that the Harpenden United Nations Association has probably never had a quote from Lenin at a meeting, and I wanted to do first here for this building. I don't know, but and I actually think that he probably wasn't the originator of it, but it does seem to sum up really the post-October world. And having, I mean, there are many of us here who, you know, David and others who've campaigned for decades on Palestine. We are now moving at a pace that none of us have seen before. And I guess if I was here pre-October, and you know, I would be focusing on why and trying to convince you to take part in BDS, as opposed to now when it's what actions should we be doing within BDS, which are the ones we need to concentrate on. You know, we've got conservative politicians talking about arms sanctions against Israel. I would have to drink an awful lot of alcohol to have thought that was possible. So we're moving into uncharted territory of Israel and Palestine. Now, the inspiration for the BDS movement coming out of Palestine was South Africa and the boycott movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s and onwards. So rather than just talk about Palestine, I think it's really important to put context in and then look at what we can learn from, what's appropriate and what's not, which will all come out in the discussion, hopefully. But I am aware that the situation is very different in apartheid South Africa and currently in Palestine. You know, if you are 80-something% of the population and you have huge economic power, if black workers withdrew their labor, it had a massive effect on the South African economy, the apartheid economy. That is not the situation that an option open to Palestinian workers. So for a whole bunch of reasons, it's very different. So I'm not suggesting we just go, well, this worked here, it must work here. But there are things that are very, very similar. The other thing is, and I do think there's a danger that people fetishize boycotts, that they almost become an end in themselves. So they're not an end in themselves, and they're not always appropriate to achieve specific objectives. And the relevance of a boycott really does depend on the nature of the objective, the balance of forces, and that is crucial. And the feasibility of particular tactics. No good saying, let's all stop Google. None of us are going to have anything to do with Google. Or sorry, I couldn't think of anything that's more, omnipotent. But you know, you have to look at things that are practical and things that can win. Because if you don't win, people become despondent. So you have to have some victories along the way. So if we start, and that's enough of Lenin for a while. He doesn't reappear, don't worry. Right. So this. Oh,
Yeah.
right. So this is an original anti-apartheid poster. So in June 1959, the boycott movement against apartheid South Africa started, and it was started by Black South Africans in exile, primarily in London, and supporters. And it was around "Don't buy South African goods," which in the UK meant it was food. And so people of my age didn't buy South African oranges. That was the primary, you'd go to, it was easy in a supermarket, but if you went to a stall, market stall, and said, "Where are these from?" they knew you weren't going to buy them, so they lied and did, "Oh, they're from Spain," and then they'd have South Africa all along the box. So that was the primary focus when it first started. You get an upturn in activity after the Sharpeville massacre. So, I mean, the good thing about very few young people here, Sarah's the youth wing, I think, is I don't have to explain certain events in history. But the Sharpeville massacre was in March 1960, and there were, I think, 69 unarmed Black South Africans who were protesting were murdered. And this led to an intensification of the boycott movement. And they moved from don't eat South African oranges to how do we isolate South Africa? How do we make South Africa a pariah state? This is not, the world is full of countries that do bad things. But South Africa, and for those, Rhodesia and now Zimbabwe, they were the countries that said, we are apartheid states and we are proud of it. So the idea was to completely isolate them in as many areas in life as possible. The Commonwealth expelled them in 1961. It's difficult to know how important that was for South Africa because so many of those countries were against apartheid. Anyway, I'm very aware that you very kindly invited me to speak, so I'm going to be moderately critical of the UN and not as much as I probably would in a different environment, because I do think the UN has let Palestine down appallingly badly. But the UN did pass a lot of non-binding trade boycotts. And that does sound familiar. If it's non-binding, then people who don't want to do it, don't do it. There's no punishment. And we have to come back to that later on. But there were no official trade boycotts by the UN on South Africa during this key period. In 1965, the UK again led the way for academic boycotts, so no cooperation between South African universities and UK ones. And then in 1970, they were expelled from the Olympics. And for many people, it's like, well, that's not the end of the world. For South Africans, sport is often how they, for white South Africans, it's how they define themselves. It is massive. Cricket and rugby are huge, and South Africa have got a great history in both sports. The fact that when they came to the UK to play internationals, people ran on the pitch, they destroyed the cricket wickets. There's a famous story told by someone called Chris Harmon, who unfortunately is no longer with us. But he was part of a gang leading from the anti-apartheid movement, whose job it was to run onto the rugby pitch at Twickenham and stop the game, which would then get tons of coverage, and hopefully people would ask why, and then he'd get to explain. But Harmon waited because there was an exciting moment of play. They were supposed to go at a certain time, and he literally waited to see what would happen on the rugby pitch before then stopping the match. So, here is a country that loves sport that, by and large, could not play international sport in its key sports. It was excluded from the Olympics, and that was a great, sport was a great success of the campaign. The other was, the cultural boycott. If you were growing up in South Africa and you were listening to music on the radio, almost with very few exceptions, you could not go and see those people because they would not come and play in South Africa. There was a place called Sun City where, they tried to make it some sort of independent place. So you can play here, it's not really South Africa. And then if you're worried about your morals, here's an enormous amount of money. So people like Elton John, Status Quo, and others. I was talking to a South African woman yesterday, and I said, what was it like growing up? She said, I had all these musical heroes, and I got to see, I think it was David Essex and Marty Kane. And now, you know, for the rest of us, we have a choice of who we go and see. We can see great actors in plays. Overwhelmingly, people did not go to South Africa. In 1976, you get the Soweto uprising. Again, this is key. People were slaughtered at the Soweto uprising, unarmed people. And you've also got the technology moving along. So it was much more on our television screens. It was all over the newspapers. And again, it gave a boost to the boycott movement, that people felt this is something we need to do. Economic sanctions, which is the obvious thing, did not take place. So during this period, you've got Harold Wilson, remember him, as Prime Minister, and then you've got Jim Callaghan as Prime Minister, and then a short period with Edward Heath. Now, Edward Heath and Margaret Thatcher, the two Conservative Prime Ministers, did not believe in sanctions. Well, they did believe in sanctions, but not against racist countries like South Africa. Labour argued, we don't support sanctions because the people who will suffer are black people, and they're the people we're trying to help. Now, the people who were asking for the sanctions were the black. They were the ones saying, please put sanctions on South Africa. We will deal with the effects. But Labour never, ever, no British government ever put economic sanctions. I think that the boycott movement against South Africa was really done by grassroots activists. It was taken up by students very much at the time. But the UN and nation states, particularly the UK, that has a great historic link with South Africa, did not really deliver. Now, the big lesson from South Africa was focus. What the anti-apartheid movement really clearly got early on is if you boycott everything under the sun, you're unlikely to have any effect. Whereas if you pick on a few organisations, you are. So Barclays was the bank that you did not bank with. And when people got a Barclays checkbook, there was a gasp. And you said, oh, you bank with Barclays. You were an anathema. You know, to be particularly a student with a Barclays bank account meant, you know, you stood in the corner of the room and no one talked to you. But the focus was always on Barclays. It wasn't on all banks. All the oil companies were culpable, but they picked on Shell and BP. And there was a policy of naming and shaming the few, because you keep repeating Barclays, 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 Barclays. The reputational damage is huge. If you list every building society and bank that had investments in South Africa, it doesn't have the same effect. You know, Barclays lost an entire generation of students. And in that period, you know, we're not talking now when you've got 50% of the population becoming students. It was 20, 25%. And they were going on to do well-paid jobs. They were the people who would have got mortgages through Barclays and taken out pensions and life assurance and would have had savings. So it was a big loss. And in fact, Barclays were forced to close, well, they in fact sold off their subsidiary because of the damage to the bank. There was a gradual move from this consumer-oriented boycott to boycotting companies who traded with, invested in, or profited from the apartheid system. In the mid-80s, there's another key moment, the township uprisings. And again, because of technology, we were able to get that broadcast on our TV screens. And we all saw the courage and dignity of people fighting back with stones and sticks against heavily armed South African police and the army. In the US, it started to pick up. The Democratic Party organized a boycott of the South African embassy. And that was huge. And you get divestment, a campaign for divestment by American students saying that their universities should not be using their funds to invest in South Africa. But the definitive moment was a speech by P.W. Botha, who was Prime Minister. And in August 95, when everybody was looking for how does South Africa reform, he made a speech called the Rubicon speech and clearly said, there will be no reforms. Mandela is not coming out of prison and we are an apartheid state. full stop. So all the banks thought this is not going to end well, and there was a flight of capital. So South Africa actually defaulted on some of its loans. You get a huge, as I said, capital flight. The exchange of the South African rand, their currency, was massively devalued. You had inflation at 12 to 15%. I laugh when I wrote that because, you know, I've been used to the last few years of 2%, 3% now, of course. But in those days, 12 to 15% was extraordinary. And South Africa needed to go to the capital markets, and it was finding it increasingly difficult. So it was then faced with a situation: how do we operate in an international economy if we can't access international funds? I.e., there is going to have to be some form of political settlement, not just we're apartheid and we're proud of it. So BDS really in South Africa began as a movement about moral responsibility. It was always the morality of the situation that they drove forward. And then it became sort of a moral argument with a political intent. So it did develop. And crudely, anyone who traded with us, South Africa, was considered complicit in apartheid. The question, of course, is, did it succeed, or do we have this romantic view that we didn't bank with Barclays, we didn't eat oranges, and Mandela was released from prison? Well, unfortunately, 1 and 1 does not equal that. But we did achieve things. We increased public awareness of the situation in South Africa, in Europe and the US in particular. I think the singly most important thing was that it reassured those in struggle that they were not alone, that actually there were people in the world who cared about their plight and were doing whatever we could do, however effective. And I think that gave them the confidence to continue to struggle, that they weren't alone. Our friends in the global capital, you know, by and large, you have to believe that people at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, when they're looking at their spreadsheets, are not, you know, they don't have a section that goes morality. However, they are looking at risk. In uncertain circumstances, there are other places for those banks to take their money. And they were looking at short-term financial advantages or medium to long-term risk. And they thought the short-term advantages are not worth it. The reputational damage to corporates, a number of organizations withdrew from South Africa and others refused to go. So that had an effect. And actually, the people who ran the apartheid system got to understand that they were in an unmanageable situation. I mean, I've yet to meet a white South African who went, yeah, I was appalled when they released Mandela. I think South Africa should be an apartheid system. What did we? No one. There was never. It was a bit like, you know, I could never find anyone who voted for Margaret Thatcher first time round, and though she won overwhelmingly. But what it meant was, when I think the year before apartheid ended, 4% of white South Africans thought it was a good idea. And yet the political leadership knew the game was up, and they had a choice. The power was going to be taken from them, or they could manage the transfer of power in a way that benefited them. And they chose the pragmatic choice. We will be in charge of this process. We will decide how it's handed over. It will not be taken from us. So that pressure, I believe, helped that situation. So eventually we get on to Palestine, which is presumably why you're here. So why was it in 2004 that a group of Palestinians decided, we have looked at the South African experience and we want to launch our own BDS campaign? And I think you've got to put stuff into context here about what was the state of the leadership. Israel had, in that period, already taken a lot of land from the West Bank. Gaza was in an awful situation. The Palestinian leadership was probably weaker than at any time since the formation of the PLO in 1964. You get a key event in 2003 when George Bush says, we are going to war with Iraq. And to go to war with Iraq, Bush needed allies. He needed Turkey. He didn't need, but he wanted to get a coalition to say this is not just an American adventure. You know, so if you look at Egypt, Turkey, the Gulf states, these are countries that have a very uneasy relationship with Israel. So for Bush, if he wanted those people on side, he did not want Israel to be involved in any of the Iraq war, in any aspect, because that would threaten the alliance. It would threaten potentially access to oil and, of course, the Suez Canal. So as part of quid pro quo, Bush said, you stay out of this, leave this to us. We don't want any involvement, and we'll increase your military spending from the US, and you can take more of the West Bank and just go on with it. You have the weirdest computer. Right, when did it start? So, let's give me a second to read that. That whilst Bush saw keeping Israel out of the Iraq war as crucial for him, what no one saw was that when, and the numbers range, you know, for London, depending who you talk to, is 1 million or 2 million. But when the police say 1 million, that's, you know, that's the minimum number I would suggest. Central to those protests, on nearly every banner, was freedom for Palestine. So the anti-war movement against the Iraq war made Palestine central to the argument. So I saw more pro-Palestinian slogans on that march than almost anything else until the recent ones. It was enormous. And this inspired Palestinian academics, Palestinian activists, Palestinian authors, who suddenly realized there was an audience out there. So if you go back, the PLO's attitude was, give us money, but really we don't want you involved in this. So the way they talked to foreign governments was, give us your cash, we need that. If you want to basically have any input to our tactics, no. We know what we're doing, we don't want any involvement from anywhere, and we don't need the international community. But they couldn't deliver, they were failing, and people saw that there was a huge audience out there that cared about Palestine. And so you get, you know, approximately 200 organizations, I mean, coming together. Palestinian organizations, you know, Dima, sorry, I don't know where you are. Yeah, hello. You know, we'll tell you, it's a very, very fractured society. It is hard to get coalitions to come together. And BDS has achieved that. And proof, I guess, of the success is the way Israel has responded to BDS. Essentially fury. In 2010, the Israeli parliament, which is called the Knesset, passed a law that said any Israeli involved in any aspect of supporting BDS would be jailed, and they were penalized and jail Arabs who lived in Israel who supported BDS. Right? They sent over the hitman to London as ambassador to say, BDS is a problem, London's the capital of BDS, we do need to deal with this. So I was looking for a quote from a politician, but the best one I found was from the Reut Institute, that is REUT. And they are one of the key think tanks in Israel. They are absolutely like that with the political class and the military. So they are, you know, part of the political establishment, if you like, in Israel. And they wrote, the delegitimization network tarnishes Israel's reputation, constrains its military capabilities, and advances the one-state solution. It went on to, with its views on the BDS campaign. This has the potential to pose an existential threat to Israel, a systematic, and increasingly effective assault on its political and economic model. So we can debate whether we think it's a good idea, but Israel sees it as a massive threat to its legitimacy as an ordinary country with a few failings. That is how Israel portrays itself yeah, there's lots of bad stuff in the world and probably some bits we need to do differently, but we're just a regular democracy. However, within Israel, they understand that the BDS movement questions that. And in 2008, Gaza was invaded. There were absolutely enormous protests, and it did change, the course and speed of events. I mean, Hamas had been elected 2 years earlier, and you saw Israeli oppression on a scale we hadn't seen really for decades, and that boosted the BDS campaign. And obviously, we're seeing that again with the genocidal attacks on Gaza now. So I want to look at the Israeli economy, not in great detail, because I think if you're boycotting aspects of a country, you have to look at where the key triggers are. Israel is has one of the most advanced economies in the world, so it's quite a foe, if you like. Its high-tech sector, and I use that in its broader sense, is probably on a par only with, I think Silicon Valley in California is probably the only part of the world that has a more advanced high-tech sector. It's got the second largest number of startups in the world after the US, and the third largest number of NASDAQ listed companies. That's when you go to list as a tech company, you go on the NASDAQ exchange. So only China and the US have more NASDAQ listed tech companies. There are 400 multinational companies that have R&D centers in Israel. And these are, tried to pick household names: IBM, Google, Hewlett-Packard, Facebook, Motorola. There are 1,400 life sciences companies in Israel. It's astonishing. Every week, a life sciences company opens. They're leaders in cybersecurity and semiconductors. So tech and aspects of technology drive the economy. Their defense sector is huge. Israel sells arms on the basis, look, when they had the the World Cup in Brazil, the Brazilian government said, well, we want to clear drug dealers and poor people out of these areas to build, stadia and stuff. And who do they use? Israel. Israel said, we know how to clear people out of villages and overcrowded areas, buy our stuff, use our defense forces. So Israel sells the fact that we are constantly at war, we have expertise, and we can help you. So I think if I said to someone, what do you boycott anything in Israel? I would suggest avocados is probably the one thing, even in Waitrose in Harpenden, where I shop every week. You can see some people, they're the ones who buy the Guardian and, probably, but they do look where the avocados come from. Agriculture is 2.4% of Israel's GDP. 2.4%. Now, I think that is important, and it's important because if you are going to hit and cause damage to a country, if 2.4% of it is agriculture, how much pain is that going to cause? So it doesn't mean we shouldn't boycott Israeli avocados and peppers and dates, but what it said is it's about emphasis, in my opinion. Industry and services dominate the Israeli economy. Israel really doesn't have much access to natural resources. Now, funny enough, you'll be shocked to hear that Gaza does. So there are, they're looking at that very clearly. But if you don't have natural resources, you are open to boycotts. If people don't sell you oil, you have a problem. South Africa had tons of natural resources. So, they were quite independent of that. But they are vulnerable. And if we look at the various BDS activities, some of you, I don't know, take part in them, but I just want to summarize them. First, I'm starting with the academic boycott, and that's different from the protests that are going on now, so I'll come back to that. So in Israel, the universities have this sort of umbilical relationship between sort of the political class and the military class. A lot of the R&D done for the military is done in Israeli universities. And particularly the technology used to police the occupation comes out of universities. So if those universities have a relationship with our universities, does that make our academics complicit in what is going on? That is the question that's being raised by academics here. Now, the University Lecturers Union, UCU, University College Union, is probably the single most hated union, by the Israelis, because they have always been at the forefront, and they have said there should be no joint research work between UK and Israeli universities. That is not its official policy, but it is continually bringing it up again and again and again and questioning why universities are doing that. And Israel sees that as a threat to its legitimacy. The second one is cultural and sporting. I mean, it's not a South Africa situation where rugby and cricket, it probably goes rugby and cricket and then maybe religion and then something else, But it is important to Israelis. And I have to talk pre-October because nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. And I don't think we're in a normal situation now. But pre-October, it was not the norm for artists to boycott going to Israel. And the few who did, there's a guy, Roger Waters, who's in a famous band, Pink Floyd. He has had torrents of abuse, called an anti-Semite, because he won't play. The majority of artists still go and play. So the current situation might well change that, But I'm sure you all watch Eurovision. I didn't, but I'm told that there's a number of the artists did protest about the involvement of Israel in the current situation, and there were protests outside. At the Olympics 4 years ago, a number of athletes forfeited rather than compete against Israelis, particularly in martial arts, boxing, etc., individual from collective sports. And obviously we've got the Paris ones coming up in this summer, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But the difference that was happening there than happening in South Africa was it was overwhelmingly Muslim athletes, and that was restricted to people from North Africa and some from the Middle East. There was not one non-Muslim athlete who said, I will not compete against Israel. So there's a lot of work for that to be done. It really doesn't like me at all, does it? Right. I wish I could have put my football team up there, but they've never won the FA Cup, so I couldn't. So this is last year's FA Cup final. Huge international figures. This is watched in every country in the world. And we've had a number of situations where sporting people have brought out Palestinian flags. There's one football club, one in Glasgow, called Celtic, where the sport for Palestine is seen as, this is who we are, it's part of our football culture. But overwhelmingly, you're not going to see support for Palestinians in football because Asian and Middle Eastern teams won't play Israel at sport. Israel is now in all the European sports competitions. So in football, when you think, oh, will my English football team be playing someone from Norway? No, they could well be playing someone from Haifa or Tel Aviv or wherever. So, but no football team has yet said, I will not play against an Israeli team. And you compare that to South Africa. So there's clearly a lot of work to be done. Recently, because of what's going on in Gaza, you've had Charlotte Church and a famous comedian who, on the way here, his name went, and I haven't got it back. It still hasn't come back, but very famous comedian, both withdrew from the Hay Festival because the Hay Festival, its key sponsor is Bailey Gifford, a company that's invested 10 billion in primarily the occupied territories, actually, but Israel in general. Ken Loach and Mike Lee, to an extent, they're left wing, you'd expect that, but they've resigned as patrons of the Phoenix, wonderful cinema that I can't go to now, because that's on the boycott list, because they're showing films that have been funded by the Israeli state. I don't know, anyone know the Latitude Festival here? I mean, this is Harpenden. Right, the Latitude Festival is where people who shop in Waitrose and listen to Radio 4 go to cultural festivals, which is obviously why Andrew and I went. I kid you not, on Sunday mornings, they boom the Archers out on loudspeakers. This is true. I just thought, this is a parallel universe. So it's very middle class, very nice, very cultured. People take their kids. It's, you know, the complete opposite of what you expect kind of music festivals to be like. But a key sponsor is Barclays. And one of the main acts on the biggest day, Saturday night, pulled out because Barclays was a sponsor, and Barclays invest heavily in Israeli defense companies. So there is an upsurge. I'm going to show my ignorance here, but Dua Lipa, is it anybody? Yeah, okay, good. Anyway, 88 million followers on Twitter. She has. I wouldn't probably know her if she walked in here and said hello. But anyway, she has 88 million followers on Twitter and has been campaigning against injustices by Israel. So social media, which has a million things wrong with it, can also be a weapon for positive work. And there's a number of recording artists who've been using their platform and the enormous followings to show what is happening and what is going on. You're going to have to be my tech assistant, sorry. This is Cate Blanchett at the Cannes Film Festival, an incredibly famous actress. And there was another actress who did the same and had her daughter dressed in a similar act of solidarity. So is Cate Blanchett wearing that dress going to make Israel go, you know what, you're right, we're going to stop? No, of course not. But it's part of a drip of every aspect of life condemning what is going on. So we talked about avocados before. Really, I want to talk about consumer boycotts. Now, then it's not the only thing that comes out of Israel, but if you walk into Tesco's, M&S, showing my middle class bit here, Waitrose, you know, you are going to get dates, peppers, certainly avocados, maybe some other fruit. And some of it says made in Israel. Historically, it would say made in the Jordan Valley. And if you weren't in the know, you'd think, well, that's not Israel, that's fine. So there are a number of apps now that look at barcodes where you can put them on your phone and it will tell you, actually, did this come from Israel? Israel also is exporting to other countries where they package the product, and therefore the barcode is where it's packaged, not where the actual product originates from. So you could get Turkey on your avocados because Turkish workers have packaged it in a factory. There's this constant race of trying to expose the double-sidedness. It is actually very difficult to get data on whether the boycott is working. It is easier in smaller shops where maybe someone owns a shop. So if you go, it's more difficult here, but in St Albans and the Hatfield Road, you've got a number of shops that if you go into them and say, I know it's Ramadan and I know Israeli dates are cheap, please do not stop them. They make that decision on the spot. If they did have them, then it's easier to convince them. It's much more difficult with Morrison's because the manager of Morrison's or the manager of Sainsbury's here probably doesn't make that buying decision. So it's centralized. So you've then got to go to headquarters and win an argument that there's enough of us who don't want them to stock Israeli products. And that is a battle that's going on. It's a very worthwhile battle, but it's going to be a long battle. And we're a long way off of South African oranges as a scenario. You see? All right. I love things to boycott things that I don't use because it's great. I don't like Starbucks coffee and I don't like McDonald's. So McDonald's fed Israeli soldiers during the attack on Gaza. And suddenly there was a boycott of McDonald's around the world. It kind of started in the Middle East, Turkey, and then it started to spread. And so they started to miss sales targets. The share price wobbled a bit. McDonald's have argued, well, they're franchise, we don't own them. It did reputational damage. McDonald's are trying to recover it. And it does show that boycotts can work. Pret a Manger, whose coffee is marginally better than Starbucks, again, they opened a number of shops in the settlements and went on the boycott list. And again, it's very difficult, as I said, to know whether that's working. A few of us in St Albans outside Pret stood outside saying, please don't go in. Here's a leaflet explaining why. There was a woman who said, but the croissants are excellent. And it was just like, okay, what do you say to that? But I was really surprised that a number of people didn't go in, and a number of people who came out said, I've thought about it, I'll go somewhere else. And then they go, oh, okay, it's Costa's next door. And you go, we can't go there either. So we kind of send them to independent coffee shops. So the big thing is, if you're trying to convince someone to get involved in the boycott, do they actually work? Well, all these companies have suffered, right? So yes, are they out of business? No. Have they changed their relationship with the state of Israel and seeing it for both R&D and for sales? Yes. So we're kind of winning. So the next bit of BD is divestment. And I would argue that this, given the problem with sanctions at the moment, is the key. Because the thing about tech and life sciences companies is they need an enormous amount of capital as both startups and to continue. Now, obviously, when they float, the owners presumably go off into the sunset with tens, in some cases, hundreds of millions. But to get to that stage, you need access to a lot of money. And I believe that you need to stop that money flowing into those companies. And it's a bit of a mixed bag, because the trouble with war is there's always someone who makes a lot of money out of it. So UBS, American bank, have increased its share since the attack on Gaza in Elbit, Israel's largest defense company. They've seen we can make a ton of money here. And it was by a staggering amount. It wasn't by 1 or 2%. In contrast, JP Morgan reduced their holding by 70%. So you haven't got a picture yet. You've got odd examples. And I think we're going to see over the coming years about where the trend is going. People ask, why are we still boycotting Barclays? It's nothing to do with the link with South Africa. It is because they are the major British investor in the two largest Israeli defense companies. And it goes back to the focus slide. Of course, there are lots of organizations investing in Israeli defense companies, but I can't boycott JP Morgan and UBS because, funnily enough, I don't have any access to them. But I can not have a Barclays bank account. And once a month, Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, PSC, asks people to stand outside and ask people to cancel. And I think it's 1,000 a day on each campaign that are cancelling accounts in Barclays. And it's not just the current account where the bank probably loses money, but it is the pensions and the life assurance where they make money. It's any deposits they make money. It's mortgages. So that is why we're hitting financial companies. The university sit-ins are really based around a demand for divestment. Harvard has 50 billion on the markets. And I did look up because I thought I must clean my glasses because that must be million. No, it's billion. Yale and Stanford are paupers. They've only got 40 billion. And the largest in the UK are Oxford and Cambridge. They get research grants, they get endowments. And instead of putting it like in a bank and saying, can I have 4% please, or whatever the number is now, they risk it on the stock market. And so there are these funds where university funds are all tied up. And that is why you're getting these protests that started in America and then inspired, I think there's 20 odd universities in the UK doing it now, saying we do not want our university to put their their money into any funds that are linked with the oppression of Palestinians. Right, but I forgot about that slide. That's good. Right. No, sorry, go back. I can use that. Sorry, I beg your pardon. So, pension funds are a real issue. So if you ring a broker or anybody and say, I'd like to have a pension, please. And you go, I don't want any money on cigarettes, armament, oil companies. They go, oh, yep, don't worry. We've got this one and it covers all of that. And that's great. If you say, I don't want my money involved in any Israeli companies that are involved in the occupation, there's a deafening silence because they're not geared up for that. That's not yet a real thing, but it is becoming one. The pension fund that all the lecturers in higher and further education, they have a pension fund which has 75 billion and owns 25% of Thames Water, by the way. So that's obviously going to go bankrupt. So that's not great, but they have money, and there are people from the University College Union demanding to know, where is this money going? Is it involved in the occupation? What is happening with this money in Israel? And at the moment, they haven't got there, but they will. We, people in this room and a few people, were involved in a campaign to ask Hertfordshire County Council, do you have any money invested in funds that are involved in the occupation in Israel? And I won't bore you now, but they chose that they didn't want to discuss it with us because they said it was too political. And then shortly later, they couldn't be involved because the pension fund were completely separate. And then Russia invaded the Ukraine, and the council said, we will divest from Russia 100%. So they can divest, it's just they want to choose who they divest from. Let me go back to the sanctions right now, sorry. This is hugely complicated. No, yeah, thank you. Because, Israel's been put on the naughty step by the United Nations. What's happening with the UN with Israel is unprecedented. It's never happened before. The US, to an extent, have lost control of the UN narrative or felt they had to do something to keep their allies on board. But in the end, in real terms, other than reputational damage, why would Israel stop? Because the UN said, please don't. What is the UN doing to say, we are going to cut off X, Y, Z, and you will not be part of the international community unless you back off? That did not happen, and it hasn't happened. And there are people here who've got strong views on it, so I think that should come out in the Q&A. But, if I say, when my children were younger, if I said, oh, please don't do that, I always found it, and I try and logically answer, ultimately it was, if you do that, you won't be able to watch telly. Remarkably, we got a result, right? And ultimately, on a wider scale, Israel has to know there are massive implications to this. And at the moment, America is saying, well, we haven't crossed our red line in Rafah. So Israel thinks, well, and the arms still come, and the money's still coming. Even after everything they've done, they have not turned off the money tap or the arms yet. So, and the argument about boycott, divestment, sanctions is about, do you do Israel as a whole, or do you just do the settlements? Do you focus on certain areas? Do you look at the occupation? Now, obviously, the settlements are an easier argument to win. If you go to people and say, here's the history of the settlements, they stole the land, they're living on it, they kicked off the population, people go, that's terrible. I think it's awful that all these companies are investing in the settlements. Yes, I think that's a good idea. If you say, I want to delegitimize Israel as a country, that is a huge thing to be discussed. And so Noam Chomsky, hopefully you know who he is, argues that for maximum impact, disinvestment campaigns should target corporations participating in human rights abuses, like Caterpillar, because Caterpillar were involved in the destruction of houses when Israel cleared Palestinians off their land. So focusing in on Caterpillar, you can win the argument on this machinery flattens houses where people are living legitimately and are kicked off the land. And that is easier to win to say, we want everything boycotted, Chomsky argues.
Caterpillar, I'm sure, didn't sell machines specifically to then knock down those towers.
No.
They sell earth-moving equipment towards.
No, exactly. Caterpillar did not manufacture them with that in intent. But once Israel bought them and used them, Caterpillar had the opportunity to say, we will not sell you anymore if you are going to use them. Or if you want to build houses in Israel proper, you can have as many Caterpillar kit as you want, but you can't use our machinery in the occupied territories. That's the argument.
Difficult to police.
Yeah. And well, that's a bit like pret-a-manger. We don't want pret-a-manger in the settlements. Are we okay with pret-a-manger having them in Tel Aviv? But ultimately, those settlements are policed by campaigners, and people do see, the campaign. There are campaigns trying to protect house demolition, and they see what machinery is doing the demolition. So we're not going to get 100%, but I agree with you. Yeah. I think the key question is, we live in an unreal situation because nobody knows. I mean, I know there are peace talks coming out currently, but in a year's time, 2 years' time, and Gaza will never go back to normality. I mean, look at it. You just have to look on your TV screens. But when Israel stops slaughtering people in Gaza, what's going to happen? How big will our movement be? Will we transfer the anger over that to that has to continue because do you know what's going on in the West Bank? Do you know what's going on in the settlements? Do you know what's going on to Palestinians living in mainstream Israel? And I think a lot of the anger is about Gaza, and our job is to educate them. It's not just about Gaza. If we look at very quickly similarities and differences, I think South Africa we're an apartheid regime, a bit like Zimbabwe. That's who we are. I would argue Israel is an apartheid regime, but denies it fiercely. I don't think the ANC have a chance of winning militarily, and I don't think the Palestinians can win militarily. And therefore, given military victory is not an option, you have to look at something else. The South African ruling class understood, maybe late in the day, but they understood what their options were. I would argue that is not the case in Israel. I think Zionism is still the dominant narrative for all Israelis, really, even the liberal ones. So there's a percentage who are opposed to the occupation. There's a small percentage that are opposed to what's happening in Gaza. But all opinion polls coming out of Israel is that the attack on Gaza is not something that is opposed by the majority of the population. It's only a small percentage. So that is a real difference between what happened in South Africa. The key thing, of course, is South Africa did not have a superpower, the world superpower, underwriting its economy and its defense industry. The United States of America, for various reasons, and I have to get this in, so I'm sorry to be sanctimonious, but I do not believe that it's the Jewish lobby that drives this, and I don't believe that it's Jews around the world that make America support Israel. America supports Israel because it's a very important strategic area, and the only government or only country that it can rely on to support Western interests are Israel. I mean, they destroyed Iraq, Syria they can't rely on. They destroyed Libya. Jordan and Egypt, we saw with the Arab Spring, could change. The only country they can turn to and say, you need to sort out Iran for us, is Israel. So they are strategically important. It's not because a few million Jews put pressure on American politicians. Israel is very, very important, particularly now with Iran. I mean, hugely significant because it's such a superpower militarily. Was that true of South Africa? They were involved in Angola. They lessened Cuban and tried to lessen Cuban and Russian influence in Africa. Was that important to the West? Yes. In the end, was it enough to say we'll keep apartheid going and underwrite it? No. That we're not at that stage yet for Israel. I think the other thing is globalization. Globalization has moved on a pace since the South African situation. There's more M&A, mergers and acquisitions. I would argue that one of the problems we have is complexity. So SodaStream were the bête noire. We all went, stood outside, well, we didn't all, but people like me stood outside. John Lewis is saying, don't stop SodaStream. They do terrible things in the settlement. That campaign went on and on and on, and John Lewis has said, we won't stop SodaStream. We thought this was a victory. Pepsi bought SodaStream. So do I boycott Pepsi? Am I allowed to have SodaStream? SodaStream a thing now? Are they just a conglomerate? I mean, with this activity, it's difficult to know where to end, because you could boycott 500 companies if you're not careful. And therefore, we'll be back to our situation of our mantra, which is focus. I don't think Palestine needs a Mandela. I know, I mean, when I was a student, I think the Tory party conference had hang Mandela badges because he was a terrorist. But in later years, Mandela was seen as a force for good. And there were others involved in the ANC towards the later stage. I don't think the Palestinian movement has one or two key individuals that are known around the world, and when they speak, the world listens. And I think that makes life maybe more difficult. I do believe Hamas, ANC were seen as terrorists, but I think having been involved in both, it was a lot easier to deal with the ANC, our terrorist argument, than Hamas, that clearly do put people off from getting involved. We also don't have a Barclays. We don't have one company that we can say to people, and I don't mean activists, I mean the general public, this company cannot continue doing what it's doing. And it captures the public imagination in the way that Barclays did over South Africa. And we have yet to do that, I believe, over Palestine. And the cultural and sporting boycotts are way behind South Africa, the situation in South Africa. What will happen, I can't say post-Gaza, but whatever comes out of the situation, I don't think we know. Last one, I promise. This is the elephant in the room. Because when you said, I oppose South Africa, I'm opposed to apartheid, you could have a debate. You know, racists said, we think apartheid's great and black people aren't clever enough to run a country. That was the abuse you got. With Israel, this is a much more nuanced argument. You are picking on the only Jewish state in the world and saying you're going to boycott it. This is anti-Semitic, right? And why aren't you picking in other countries? Why Israel? Lots of bad countries. No one in the BDS campaign is saying Israel is the only bad country in the world. I mean, the list is endless, right? But I would argue that Israel is unique in what it does, and that the Palestinian situation is unique in that the world superpower underwrites their oppression, right? And so that is why Israel are the target, because the Palestinians cannot liberate themselves. They need that support, has to come from elsewhere. And it's got nothing, you know, Israel can bang on about it being the Jewish state. Well, I'm Jewish, not my state. It doesn't represent, you know, the idea that it represents Jewish opinion, it doesn't even represent its own population at the moment. But this is a problem. And it comes up again and again and again. And because like particularly in the UK, for historic reasons, the last few years with Corbyn and everything, you've still got Starmer, a woman who thought she was the MP, going to become the MP for Chingford, or the candidate, you know, was suddenly cut off. She had a 5-year-old baby on her lap during her interrogation, where she had 5 hours notice for. And it was like, you've liked a tweet. Yeah, but the video is by a Jewish comedian. Yeah, but the bit underneath isn't. And did she read it? No. Should she have read it? I don't know. Probably. But, you know, this is a sleep deprived, she's got mastitis. You know, it's this whole anti-Semitism is weaponizing. The weaponizing of anti-Semitism is used as a way of deflecting criticism of Israel. And it's happened within our politics here in Britain, but also by Israel as well. The only way BDS succeeds is if lots and lots and lots of people are involved. So if you're not involved in the Palestinian BDS campaign, please do. It's a great organization. My lovely assistant will. This is, if you go onto the internet, you can learn all about it. And there is also a fantastic organisation in St Albans. I'm completely objective. St Albans Friends of Palestine, that does absolutely incredible work. And depending on how much involvement you want or which areas you want to be involved with, it ranges enormously, from peace vigils to being outside Barclays to educationals. So please, come along to one of our meetings. We'd love to see you.
Can I add to that? Luton is a very active
It does.
Palestine solidarity campaign. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but we do campaign, we do have rallies. I think we spoke at one of our rallies actually at the town hall. So that also.
Yeah, it's a great organisation.
Convoys.
It's and also a key member is standing for Parliament from Luton PSC as an independent. You're the lawyer.
Sorry.
Yeah, he's standing as and his slogan has Palestine.
You're not standing in Luton.
Yes, he is. He's standing against one of the Galloway candidates. He's an independent, and there's going to be 2 Galloway candidates and him as an independent. Yeah, I'll talk to you later. Yeah.
So
Repeat the question or addition. You couldn't hear it.
before you do, let's thank and then
No,
we'll
no,
go.
no. Sorry, I didn't hear it.
I can hear you fine. I couldn't hear what you said.
Right.
We'll have Q&A now, but let's give a thank to Peter. Looking at the time, maybe half an hour, so Q&A. Linda?
I've got a question.
Yes, sorry.
When you're talking about the things that can be boycotted, it takes me back to when I was a student in the 60s. There was quite a big campaign about boycotting Israeli bananas, 5Es bananas.
Right.
5Es bananas, if I recall correctly, came from Israel, and I can remember taking part in boycotting Israeli. Now, was that because of the '67 war?
I don't know. I didn't know about that. Sorry.
No, I don't know if anybody else knows, but I can recall very clearly boycotting South African, not South African, Israeli. Yes, it was Israeli because it was these 5Es bananas.
I don't know.
So I mean, I think it's another thing that it's worth people looking into where bananas come from, and including that in this.
Okay. Thank you. No, I'll have a look.
I lived through most of the apartheid in South Africa, the introduction of it and the fall of it.
Sorry.
2 key issues why it fell down. Okay. Firstly, the Soviet Union collapsed. And South Africa and the Soviet Union were the suppliers of some key minerals which were needed by the West. And for as long as that was happening, the UK, as well as the United States, was allowing South Africa to carry on and defeat the boycott campaign. Now, when that was a key moment. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that almost instantly, the UK and the United States dropped South Africa. They no longer needed South Africa, they could get it from the Soviet Union. Point number 1. Point number 2 is P.W. de Klerk, who wasn't the spokesperson of all of the nationalist government. He was the head of the nationalist party and the head of the government, but he had a stroke. And what we need is Netanyahu to get a stroke, because that would be the equivalent. Okay? The equivalent situation. When P.W. de Klerk was out of the question, F.W. de Klerk P.W. was out FWK came in, and he is the one who then eventually got Mandela out. But by the way, those negotiations were already undertaken whilst P.W. Botha was in power. Right? But he wasn't going to let it go all that easily. So those two key moments. So you need something like that to happen in Israel before Israel actually changes things, and the boycotts actually are going to have the effect that you want them to have.
Okay.
Could I ask if you've got any views about changes in the US as a result of the last 6 or 7 months and the optional pattern in October? It seems to me there's a chance of it, no more than that. Very cautious to say, but there's always been a huge Jewish lobby in the United States supporting Israel. Some signs that there may be changes of views coming from the United States, which seems to be, has been the main supporter of Israel in the United Nations and other areas. Just interested in your lobby, in your view of that, because I mean that could be quite important.
For example, the Trump possible.
Yeah, totally.
Any views?
So, so if I thought the Netanyahu's getting a stroke would help, I would find everyone I knew who was religious and get them to pray every night and wish bad things on him. However, I think he'll go. I don't think he's long in the role, and he'll be replaced by Benny Gantz or someone like Benny Gantz, whose record on Palestine is appalling. And the reason that Israelis are out demonstrating nearly every Saturday is nothing to do with what's going on in Gaza. They don't like the internal changes with the judiciary. So they think that they've got a leader who is essentially trying to usurp the judiciary. They don't care about what's going on they don't seem to care what's going on in Palestine. And I fear that a Benny Gantz or someone like him who's going to say, we'll leave the judiciary alone, but we'll continue by and large with the policies that I've supported for years on Palestine, won't lead to as big a change as you felt would have happened in South Africa. I think Netanyahu's like, he's toast. I think everyone thinks he can't survive this. And that's why they're jostling.
But he needs a war to go on for him to stay there.
Well, during the middle of a war, will they change him? They might now, because by and large, they think most of it's done, I think. So, I mean, there isn't much else to destroy, really. I don't know what. So, but I think there'll be an election quite soon. And I think he won't survive. And I think it's whether they can get a coalition that excludes I use the word extreme, I mean the extreme of the extreme. Extreme is the power of two. Some of the people who are now defence secretary and people like that, can they exclude them from the next government? But I think if I was a Palestinian, I would think that was all irrelevant. I wouldn't think that anything in my life would be better for a change of government, which may, obviously you know a lot more about South Africa than I do. And I didn't know, enough about the minerals, so thank you. I think Trump in America, if he wins, it's going to be a disaster for the Palestinians because his support is unbelievable for Israel. But more importantly, his supporters, and you can't pressurize the Trump supporters over Israel. The Democrats, however, have got, we saw recently, where you've got a Muslim boycott, really, essentially, which is much more powerful than anything a Jewish group can do, because there aren't enough Jews, to actually boycott voting for the Democrats. You've had, on a really small scale, some people talking about that in Britain. They won't vote for the Labour Party because it didn't support the ceasefire. So I think that the Democrats are more vulnerable over Israel because their voters are more liberal, if I can use that term. If you are black, a Muslim, or a Jew, you're overwhelmingly going to vote Democrat. That's not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. So you've got black people and Muslims saying supporting what's going on in Israel is atrocious. They won't, I don't think, vote for Trump, I assume, but they may well stay at home. If they don't come out to vote, we can end up with Trump. Because like when the day he came out of prison, they were showing, it's 10,000 votes here, 10,000 votes there, determine the election. And if people don't come out to vote, then Trump could get in on that basis, because apparently committing felonies doesn't seem to matter. So, so they don't, his vote didn't, he's got 40 million in contributions since that court case, since the verdict. So there are people out there who just don't care. So I think that every year the research comes out, each generation, well, not every year, but every generation of Jews is less connected with Israel than America. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is intermarriage. I'm a specialist in that, as is my sister. So our kids grow up with a whole bunch of cultures, not like me, that was monoculture. You're Jewish, you don't need to worry about anything else. So that has changed. And I think the further we go from the Holocaust in generational terms, I grew up with a father who says, my cousins were in Belgium and they went and died in Auschwitz. So that was imprinted on me, and I've imprinted it on my kids, but will it be on their kids? And each generation moves further away from that, I think. And also, Israel has just got worse and worse and worse. And therefore, if you're an American Democrat, you're saying, why would we support this? And so I think that there is a break. It doesn't mean that there aren't people lobbying for Israel that are massive, but the biggest lobby group in America for Israel are the evangelical Christians. And that is a massive bloc that dwarfs anybody else, really. We've got a Palestinian there.
Can I just add something? Because I'm a Palestinian and I grew up in the occupation. And I think I do agree a lot with what you
Stand
said.
up, just can you say no to you now?
Okay, I'll project my voice. I'm a Palestinian that grew up under occupation. And I grew up under Labour governments mainly. And as Peter was saying, they started the settlements in the West Bank. When I was growing up, you could hardly see any settlements. But as the decades went on, you could see them. But coming back to your point and your question about the Jewish support in the US, I think that's a very dangerous idea that I don't believe in. There is an IPAC a pressure group, as there are lots of pressure groups in the States. But as Peter is saying, the support for Israel from the Brits, from the French, from Europeans, from the US, has been mainly to support a settler colonization movement and to control resources. The minute the oil goes and you have renewable energy, no one's going to care. But they care about transport through the Suez Canal. That's what they want for Iran, right? One of the poorest countries on the planet. And they continue to support Israel. The other point, Peter, is Saudi Arabia is a pretty good supporter of the US at the moment.
Yeah, no.
So it's not just, that's the irony that you've got Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be very careful about the use of the pro. There is support, but I think the real factors are that's my opinion.
I've got a quick question on surveillance. When I tried to advertise your talk on LinkedIn,
I thought you could.
I will ask. When I tried to advertise your talk on LinkedIn, it didn't like the word against Israel.
Yeah.
I tried many times. I took the word out, bang, it posted it. Same thing on MailChimp and other. They do filter what you say. So this BDS movement, if we support it, are we likely to be under surveillance ourselves in the things we do, Google search and things like that? Have you faced anything like that?
No, but fairly inconsequential. So, if I was in Cheltenham GCHQ, I wouldn't be worrying about Peter Segal. Yes, Facebook, if you try and publicize Facebook stuff. But on the other hand, I think a lot of campaigning groups face it and left-wing groups, because it's a program, an algorithm that decides that you're not speaking to a human being going, look, you know, we've got a Jewish speaker, it's not anti-Semitic, with the UNA. You don't get to negotiate that. It's an algorithm that goes, this could be a problem. So yes, it's throughout the country. Technology is blocking our ability, and we're constantly looking for ways around it. Yeah.
Peter, you pointed out that the agricultural sector in Israel is pretty small, and therefore boycotting that would not have a great effect. For many ordinary people in this country, that is actually their only real interface with Israeli goods, if you like. So would you agree that it's got a symbolic effect?
100%.
If we demonstrate outside supermarkets or whatever about their stocking stuff, that is a way of interacting with the public and getting them to be, because I mean we can boycott parties, but most of the other things are really out of our reach.
Yeah. No. And on the 15th of June, Saturday, there will be outside Tesco's in St Albans a leaflet saying, please don't shop it. Please don't buy Israeli goods. So no, I agree. It is symbolic, and it's difficult for us as individuals. As I said, I can't boycott UBS. Sorry.
One of the tools we had as students, because we realized we had very limited supermarkets and we were poor. So we didn't want the supermarket to kind of close down, but we wanted to give them the message. And what we used to do is take our trolleys and fill them with everything we could from South Africa that might have been related to South Africa. And then we would take an A3 piece of paper that had been printed, contaminated with human blood, do not touch. How you print on the top of these trolleys. So kind of, it didn't stop people going to the supermarket, but what it did do is it stopped the supermarket then investing in South African goods and the management of So, it was quite effective because, it's very hard, isn't it, to just say, all right, I'm not going to Sainsbury's, Tesco, Morrison, because they all have within them Israeli goods of some description. So fill your supers, fill your trolleys.
So is anyone here in the police force? Okay, so I've got 500 stickers that say don't buy apartheid. And it's a PCS Palestinian thing. And what I put it on, and someone's put it, go into supermarkets and put it actually on the groceries. So if someone's thinking of buying avocados, peppers, now I know bananas or whatever, those stickers are there. And it just may stop them for a second to think, should I be buying these products? Or even go away and think, But the trolley thing is great. We've done that.
Well, doing what you're doing could give rise to some kind of criminal charge. But actually taking things, putting them in a basket and changing the mind, that's perfectly reasonable.
Elizabeth?
There is an organisation in America called JVP, which is Jewish Voice for Peace. They are very active. They have had thousands of people out protesting what they're supporting the Palestinians in a very positive and very outreaching way. Unfortunately, I can't support them in one of the ways they would like me to, because they're constantly asking us to write to Congress to end the war. And every time I write in AL5, they say this is not, of course it is not, which is frustrating. A tremendous amount of work.
Yeah, very good.
How do you see the role of the media in the UK? Not the right-wing media,
Right.
the media.
Yeah, thank you.
Broadcast media, the more neutral or sober media, how influential is that on public opinion in this country?
The JVP are great, but also there are organisations in the UK. So on the Palestinian marches, there's a Jewish bloc, and that has got larger. I've marched on that, and it has got larger and larger. And so there's Na'amods, there's a Jewish socialist group, the one in Labour, a Jewish Voice for Labour, Jews for Justice, Jews Against the Occupation. So there, but I think JVP are great. The media is complex because every time they give stats, they say the Hamas-run health service. And I want, next time they're talking about hospital waiting lists, to say the Tory-run NHS. Because, you know, why do they say the Hamas-run hospitals and give stats on injured and deaths, but they never refer to the NHS as the Tory-run NHS? I mean, right? I mean, I'm not. Sorry. Yeah, no, the barely working Tory-run NHS, but so I don't think it's neutral, and there's a lack of, for example, Jewish voices who are against what's going on in the mainstream media. You don't really difficult to hear them, and yet there are 2 or 3 people who constantly get brought on to say why it's not safe for Jews to be out on a Saturday when there's a demonstration. They never talk about the rise in Islamophobia with as much emphasis as they do about anti-Semitic attacks are awful, please, but you know, you have to put them in the context of why they're happening. And yes, anti-Islamophobic attacks are up as well. So I think I know someone who's resigned from the BBC. I can't give his name, but he resigned because his stories were being stamped on, and he wasn't allowed to say what he wants. And I think that for a whole bunch of reasons, the media see Israel as our ally and that we're not neutral. And I think it's really, really difficult. So I've really got most of my information of what's going on the internet. And again, unless it's from a trusted source on the internet, you can never, you know, at least you know with the beep there's bias and you kind of work out which bit's the bias. But so I have watched some Al Jazeera quite a lot on the news, which has been helpful. But I think the mainstream media has been absolutely shocking, and I spend a lot of my life shouting at a television and a radio. I think, you know.
Yeah, this is a question or comment which I don't really think there is any answer. You mentioned that, you know, the shift at the UN, members of the UN being much more anti-Israel in view of what's been happening in Gaza. And you also mentioned that decisions made are non-binding, but this really has always been I was going to say problem, but I don't really mean problem, because in a sense it's been a strength as well. This has always been the position of the UN, that you know, they can discuss and as much as they like, but no decisions that they make are ever actually binding, can ever actually be enforced. I mean, Antonio Guterres has been more outspoken on Gaza than, you know, than any former Secretary General that I can remember. But nothing actually can be enforced, and particularly because, you know, the US, for example, that holds a major position on the Security Council. You know, how do you get beyond that? That is what I find so frustrating.
Well, here's the man.
Well, the UN General Assembly resolutions are not binding, but Security Council resolutions are binding. But of course, America will always veto it.
That's it.
So structurally,
yes,
there's something wrong with the system, which the Security Council needs to be totally reformed or disbanded.
But even there are no real sanctions if if what is binding is not actually obeyed.
The other thing is UN itself is not a power; it's composed of members.
That is
So-
in a sense why there is no answer to.
There's no one
this
higher up
situation.
apart from God. Even He doesn't want to get involved
Yeah.
to run us. Yeah, ICJ is.
It does have, okay, it may not have immediate power, but it does have repercussions.
Oh, yes, I mean, the
So-
ICJ and the ICC as well.
Yeah.
But apart from anything else, the processes that go through
But the
the
pressure
two courts takes so many years to
when the global south comes with numbers, it does matter in the long term.
It does
I think it's very important. And one thing Peter said, which is the Palestinians seeing this. When I speak to my cousins in the West Bank, you know, and I say, look, this is a demonstration, they say, is it making a difference?
Oh, yes.
And I say, well, I think it is,
Mhm.
unfortunately for them,
Yeah.
and the immediate.
It's not fast enough.
It's not good enough, or it's not fast enough. But as Peter said, there is a qualitative change.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So,
Question.
If I just be anecdotal for a moment.
Yeah.
My first bank account was with Barclays for no reason other than that my parents had already always banked with them and they opened it. But then the divestment boycott campaign came along, so I wrote to the local manager of the Barclays branch and told them why I was closing the account. And I got a letter back, which is a list of the extent of the involvement of all the other British clearing banks in South Africa. The argument seemed to be that 15 rights made a wrong, wrongs made a right. They weren't attempting to defend their position, they were merely trying to achieve guilt by association, which I thought was a curious response to the circumstances, but that was then and now is now. It seems to me that one of the great advantages that South majority had in South Africa during the apartheid era is that they had some very compelling spokespeople, very compelling symbols, and they couldn't ask for something better than Mandela in Britain, as it were, to crystallize opinion. But there were some very able and effective advocates of change in South Africa on the global stage. Where is the Palestinian Greta Thunberg to be found?
They're in prison,
I was going to say,
and they're exiled, and they've been killed. And there are people there. The problem maybe is that it's not coming through because of the media that we're talking about as well. But the younger generation are hearing via social media. I mean, there is a dissonance there between what one generation is hearing and reading and what another is. They are there, and there is a Nelson Mandela in prison.
Barghouti.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, just Trevor.
I'm happy to support pressure on both participants in this conflict, because Hamas have abused their abilities as well. But we've already heard that there are sanctions on could be more effective than the ones we've just been talking about, which are to cease supplying arms to Israel and to Hamas as well. That would, and of course there are countries supplying arms to Hamas, I'm sure. So that I would advocate that as the most, and there seems to be a potential within this country that we could move in that direction. But it seems to me the South African lesson, most importantly, is not just about sanctions, it's about having two leaders who are willing to talk to each other. And that is what I'd like us to focus on now, if we could, is what's the prospect of having peace talks succeeding? There have been peace talks, and there's a draft waiting to be endorsed or not. Qatar seems to be the main
proponent of peace talks. Although the UN, as we just heard, does have some pressure it can bring to bear. I'm saddened that the UN doesn't seem to be involved in those peace talks. Perhaps it is, and we don't hear about it. But the influential people behind Israel and the Palestinians need to be trying to persuade them to come to negotiations. And I was wondering whether you see any prospect of that, because I don't see a resolution until we've got people who are willing to come and sit down and talk to each other.
One point I'd like to make is this did not start in October.
Of course not.
And no, but that's what everyone focuses on. Oh, we need to stop this situation now. And if those who do start in October start the sentence with Hamas, right? So I'm not here to defend Hamas, but it's not that we haven't got two people who are willing to talk to each other. Israel has never accepted a Palestinian state, ever. And it doesn't accept it now. Oslo, my fear, and I know it's yours, is that we're going to get Oslo 2.0, which is, oh, we'll give you this, and suddenly, oh, right, you can police the occupied territories for us, but actually you won't get a Palestinian state. The settlements will continue to grow. So if the New Deal, which on my way here, I heard Biden's speech, and he seems quite confident that something, and Hamas was saying, we've got something to talk to, and the Israeli, they might be able to cobble something together over this specific situation in Gaza. What happens? Israel withdraws. You've got no water, you've got no electricity, no hospitals, no schools, no houses. What happens then? What happens to the settlements? What happens in East Jerusalem? This is a bigger question, and there is no Israeli who is saying you must have a Palestinian state and we will withdraw, let's be charitable, to 1967 borders. Let's just say there is not one who's prepared to do that, not one leading Israeli politician. And until you get one of those, and they have support, I mean, it's no good having an Israeli politician without support. The Israeli electorate has elected politicians who every year have taken more and more Palestinian land. So there is, unfortunately, the tide is going the wrong way for us. And I think, will they cobble something together? Undoubtedly, because Israel can't let this go on forever. The Palestinians, have no say in this. Ultimately, they're the ones being attacked. But ultimately, Israel does not want to be in a permanent arms economy bombing Gaza. There's nothing left. Once they've finished in Rafah, I don't know what else they want. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say there's no one talking. And also, I think with the arms, Israel is a nuclear power with one of the most advanced armies in the world. Hamas rockets occasionally kill people, very, very occasionally. They cause disruption and they cause great mental distress. That if you're living in a country and rockets are coming in and you're having to go to bunkers, must be awful for Israelis. But Hamas doesn't really have a serious arms weaponry in the sense of Israel, in the way that Israel does. It's not an equivalent, I would say.
I just make the point. Hamas is rather equivalent to the IRA. We lived through a situation in Britain where the British state was dominating the Irish population for many years, many centuries, with enormous negative consequences for the Irish and very damaging consequences. Britain went through the Irish question in Parliament. It was only when the IRA took up arms ineffectually against the British state that ultimately the British state said it isn't in our interest to carry on. And So you ended up with a cobbled together peace solution. I think that's equivalent to any conflict situation. And the situation in Palestine, Israel, goes back, as Peter well pointed out, very, very long time before the establishment of the State of Israel. And we have looked at it, and we in the West have been very much influenced by Israeli propaganda. I recall the United Nations had a meeting very shortly after the 9/11 attacks in New York. The gentleman who came was somebody from the American Embassy. And he stood up and he said, we were expecting an analysis, a detailed intellectual analysis. And this gentleman stood up and he said, I want you to think of the United States as an 800-pound gorilla in a world of 300-pound gorillas. And when the 800-pound gorilla wants his bananas, he gets his bananas. As it wants, when it wants, how it wants. It then went on to say there are only two democracies in the world, United States and Israel.
Any questions?
Germany was not, and I say this because my wife is from Germany, is not a democracy because they're still a Nazi country. France were
You'd have to do better than that, shut
You have a question?
I have a question. How do you break this overwhelming dominance of historical accumulations apart from going for a morals situation, to address the moral situation, because Israel is corrupt morally, the people are paranoid and cannot get out of this. The United States is fostering it. I can't see any way around this unless there is a pull-out of the United States.
One more question.
I seem to remember reading that 17% of the Israeli population came from Russia over a number of decades. And in general, they are the ones that are supporting the settlement. Because they've got proportional representation in Israel, that 17% is always going to be dominating Israeli politics. And I wondered if you could sort of see how that can change.
Their PR system was set up to ensure that no one had a majority. They saw that as a good thing. In many countries, that's something people worry about. So it has to be a coalition government, and unless they have constitutional change. And you've got power blocks. And it is overwhelmingly people from Russia who are driving the settlement movement. So they're one block. You've got the ultra-Orthodox, which is another power block. And there's been a bit of a change, because originally the ultra-Orthodox were like, the Messiah will create the Jewish state. So we wait for the Messiah, who hasn't come. And then we just pray. We don't need to be involved in the state. And no, we're not joining the army, thanks. They have moved, become more involved in Israeli politics. So they're a really significant power block. You've got the settlers that are power block. You've got some of the Americans who go to do Aliyah, which is go and live in Israel. They are not the sort of liberal, why can't we live all together in peace, people who are going to live in Israel. So I don't know how, without constitutional change, that will ever happen. But if you look at emigration from Israel, it tends to be the more liberal-minded people who leave, who don't want to be part of it. And of course, that exacerbates the situation because the others become a bigger and bigger and bigger majority. So I find it astonishing that there is not one demonstration since October in Israel say stop this slaughter. Whereas they've had the equivalent sorry to interrupt you, but the demonstrations have had about Netanyahu's judicial reform would be the equivalent in Britain of millions of people on the street, if you look at the population differences, right? So they can demonstrate, boy, can they demonstrate, they just don't demonstrate for Palestinians.
My supplementary question
Yeah.
is a point. Every time a leader from Israel has emerged who wants to compromise the extreme right-wing government.
Well, Rabin is the obvious one, yeah.
It doesn't give a good precedent, does it? If you're an Israeli leader?
No, you would need a life assurance in policy, maybe. So, it's going to sound amazingly glib, because otherwise we'll be here till 3 o'clock this afternoon. I think the only way we'll get change is another Arab Spring, but one that actually involves Egypt with a change of government. Palestinians need friends, real friends in the Middle East. The Saudis, you know, who needs friends with, you know, enemies with friends like that, you know. So they need a change in powerful countries. So there's a bloc in the Middle East that actually support the Palestinians. And I think that is as optimistic as I can be. Because there will be a point for when America says, actually, this isn't worth it. And I don't know when that tipping point is, because I've predicted it incorrectly every year for years, so don't look at me. I do think most imperialist powers generally go, this is not worth it. I don't need this. And Ireland was a good example. Why on earth were we hanging on to Ireland when it was causing us all this grief? We'll negotiate it, dodge it, and dunk. And no more bombing in London. And we don't have to have troops in Belfast. So they do maneuver. I just don't know if America's ready for that. And Iran, the obsession with Iran is quite astonishing, but they are obsessed with Iran, whether they should or shouldn't be. And as long as that current Iranian regime's there, I can't see any weakening of support for Israel. So.
One last question, ma'am. I'm sorry, we will have to finish.
I just wanted to ask about, so when we talk about support from neighbours for Israel, for Palestine, part of the problem that I perceive is the petrodollar is being signed up to by 17 of the Arab countries. And for the first time, I think, in history, since that happened 70 odd years ago, Saudi Arabia, which is the biggest single importer of oil, exporter of oil, sold to China, who is the biggest buyer of their oil, in yuan digital currency on the 17th of October.
Wow.
So I think that has created a huge shift, which our media is totally keeping under the radar, and which I think could, you know, if we just become more aware of that and improve this, which is also why I think we've got this massive, like almost hysterical move towards electric vehicles and things, you know, it's become hysteria, hasn't it? And, you know, lots of people would be much more expert than I could ever be. Stand here and tell you why electric vehicles on the green vehicles are being sold. So, yeah, I just wondered what you thought on, you know, in terms of the petrodollar and how that's going to influence the other Arab countries, in order to be more supportive of Palestine.
I don't think the current regimes support Palestine because they see America both as a threat and a friend. But also in Jordan, you know, it's not a democracy. Egypt is not a democracy. Those, whether official dictatorships or monarchies, they are kept going and supported by the West, right? So they have a vested interest in maintaining those relationships with the West. So until they are removed and there is a truly democratic government in Egypt and Jordan and other countries who will stand up to the West and support Palestine, you know, and that it did spread, but the Arab Spring was just a snapshot of what was possible. I understand it didn't work because, you know, Algeria, Morocco, you know, it needs more, you know, because if I was a Palestinian and we've got one here, why on earth would you look at any government with any confidence that they would stand by you and not sell you down a bit? Just because history tells you that.
Right, I think we'll have to stop. Thank you very much, Peter. One more time. Those who are staying for the party, please take your chair and join us. We've got about a couple of hours. You're not staying, are you?
I've got to go and I just got a phone call to buy baby wipes. Very nice to meet you.
By the way, there's just one thing. Have you ever heard about
Oh, do you know what I know there's been an accident with, you touched on that.
shooting?
I've got to go. I'm not. Thanks for coming. My point is,
My point there brings into context, and by the way, the shooting from those two context, what happened